Welcome to the debate. When we look at a modern map, the edges are perfectly defined. Satellites have mapped every coastline, every mountain range, every deep sea trench. The margins are just geography.
Right. They are quantified, charted, and entirely predictable.
Exactly. It's a closed system. We know exactly what is on the other side of the ocean, and we know exactly what we'll find when we get there. But if you unroll a high medieval map, like the famous Hereford Mappamundi from the late 13th century, the edges aren't just geography.
No, they're really not.
Suddenly, those strict, comfortable boundaries of the known world fracture. You're looking at a landscape populated by the unimaginable. You see dog-headed men, you see bleeding trees, you see islands where people are born with one giant foot, and they use it as an umbrella to shade themselves from the blistering sun.
It is the absolute definition of a conceptual frontier, because the map doesn't just show physical space, right? It illustrates the extreme limits of the human imagination and the natural order itself. It shows you where the rules of reality start to bend.
Exactly. And today we are exploring the fascinating cognitive and cultural landscape of the High Middle Ages through the early modern period. Specifically, we are looking at how European naturalists, theologians, and travelers documented the marvelous and the preternatural, the wonders of the world.
Which forces us to ask a really profound central question.
It does. And the question is this. Was this high medieval and early modern fascination with wonders primarily an emerging proto-empirical aesthetic appreciation of nature's vast diversity, or was it fundamentally a theological framework, a system used to decode divine portents and strictly police human moral boundaries?
It is a massive question, because it really asks how the modern scientific mind was born or, delayed.
Right. So I'll be arguing that the period study of wonders represents a crucial, almost secular shift. I see it as an aesthetic appreciation of natural diversity, where the sheer variety of the world was celebrated for its own sake.
Planting the early seeds for empirical science?
Precisely. And I believe they were looking at these marvels and laying that groundwork.
And I will be representing the perspective that this fascination never truly broke from a deeply anchored Augustinian theological framework. In my view, these wonders were not objects of secular curiosity at all.
They were religious?
Entirely. They were moral allegories and divine signs designed to demonstrate God's omnipotence and sometimes his terrifying wrath.
Okay, let's lay out our positions so we know exactly where we stand. When you look at the medieval compilation of wonders, works like Gervase of Tilbury's catalog, the Otia Imperialia, which literally translates to Recreation for an Emperor, written around 1210, or Marco Polo's later travelogues, you see a highly sophisticated appreciation for nature's variations.
But was it really scientific appreciation?
Well, marvels at the margins of the world weren't things to be terrified of. The magnetic lodestone, the mythical phoenix, or the diverse human races described in the East, they were objects of pleasure. They were objects of intense curiosity. These thinkers actually understood the relativity of wonder.
Wait, what do you mean by the relativity of wonder?
Well, the theologian James of Vitry, for example, noted that a cyclops might marvel at a two-eyed man just as much as we marvel at a cyclops.
Oh, wow. That's interesting.
It's a massive conceptual leap that points to a highly rational recognition of geographic and biological diversity. They were looking at an autonomous natural order, one that operated on its own rules, even if those rules produced extreme variations at the extreme edges of the map. They were essentially saying, hey, nature is just different over there.
I see the logic there, but if we look at it from another angle, we have to look at the foundational architecture of the marvelous. And that architecture was undeniably theological, rooted heavily in the writings of Augustine of Hippo.
Right, the heavy hitter of medieval theology.
Exactly. For Augustine and the entire medieval intellectual tradition that followed him, wonders existed strictly to demonstrate the boundless omnipotence of God. Augustine explicitly used the unconsuming flames of Mount Etna in Sicily, or the legendary salamander that survives in fire, to prove to skeptics that human bodies could indeed burn eternally in hell without being destroyed.
So you're saying the physical world was just a prop for theology?
Completely. The natural facts compiled in the great encyclopedias and bestiaries of the era weren't collected for the sake of biological curiosity. They served as vital tools for biblical exegesis, for interpreting scripture.
But what about when things happened nearby?
Well, when a local anomaly occurred, a so-called prodigy or portent, it was interpreted with profound horror. They were using these monsters to police human behavior and enforce the rules of society. It wasn't an aesthetic marvel. It was a deliberate sign of divine wrath and a symptom of moral breakdown.
Okay, let's dive right into that geographic divide. This idea of the margins of the world versus the center of the world in Europe, because I think this is exactly where my point is proven.
Go on.
If we look at the travel narratives of the 13th and 14th centuries, Marco Polo, Odoric of Pordenone, John Mandeville, we see a massive tonal shift in how Europeans thought. Before the Mongol peace opened up the East to trade, early medieval texts like the 8th century Liber Monstrorum depicted the margins of the world with absolute terror.
Right, monsters that would eat you raw in the dark.
Exactly. But as trade and travel actually opened up, that depiction shifted to extravagant, almost joyful aesthetic appreciation.
But wasn't that heavily romanticized? It was just exoticism, wasn't it?
It was expansive. If you're listening to this, think about modern space exploration. Think about when the Perseverance rover found traces of ancient rivers on Mars. We didn't panic and think Mars was cursed by demons. We thought, wow, the universe is bigger and more complex than we knew.
That's a fun analogy.
And that is exactly what reading Marco Polo was like for a 14th century merchant. It was an optimistic exercise in understanding diverse environments. When European travelers heard about a Scythian lamb, which was a creature said to be a literal lamb born from a gourd on a plant in Asia, attached by its belly button, they didn't cross themselves in terror.
No, they traded stories about it.
Right. They treated it as a fascinating biological equivalent to their own local marvels. In Ireland, they had barnacle geese, which were birds they genuinely believed grew on trees over the water.
Oh, the barnacle geese, right?
Yeah. John Mandeville's texts were beautifully illustrated, showing European merchants happily exchanging a branch of barnacle geese for a Scythian lamb. It was an acknowledgement that nature is playful, diverse, and operates differently in different climates. It was data collection, even if the data was flawed.
I come at it from a different way. I completely agree that the distant margins allowed for these safe, exotic fantasies. I mean, when a marvel is 5,000 miles away in India or Ethiopia, it's incredibly easy to treat it as a delightful curiosity, a bauble for a prince's court.
Sure.
But the true function, the real cultural weight of the wonder framework is revealed when anomalies happen in the center.
Meaning when it happened in their own backyard.
Precisely. When a wonder occurred locally, in Europe, the aesthetic appreciation vanished instantly. It wasn't an object of pleasure. It was a terrifying prodigy. Let's look at the historical record. In 1317, conjoined twins were born in Florence.
Okay.
The chronicler Giovanni Villani wrote about it, and the poet Petrarch remembered the sheer horror it caused when he was a child. The priors of Florence literally refused to allow the infants into the city palace.
Wait, why? Were they afraid of contagion?
No, they feared it signified future political and physical harm to the city. It was a monster in the original Latin sense of the word monstrare, which means to show or to warn.
I see.
Or take the comet of 1066, which is famously woven into the Bayeux Tapestry. When they looked up at that comet, it wasn't viewed as an interesting astronomical phenomenon. It was a divine herald of King Harold's downfall and the bloody Norman conquest. When the disruption of the natural order was local, the framework was purely about policing boundaries, steeped in anxiety and the fear of God's judgment.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Doesn't that change depending on what kind of monster we're talking about? Because they didn't treat a whole race of dog-headed men the same way they treated those twins in Florence.
Well, they were different phenomena.
Right, and I think we have to look at how they fundamentally categorize reality, because there's a massive intellectual difference between what they called a marvelous species and a monstrous individual.
And you think that distinction supports the idea of an emerging scientific mindset?
I really do. Hold on, I think we just hit on the most crucial point of this entire era. Let's underline this. A marvelous species like the dog-headed cynocephaly was seen as a permanent, naturally caused race. A monstrous individual, like the conjoined twins in Florence, was a unique, local anomaly. The very fact that medieval thinkers made this sharp intellectual distinction proves that they believed in an independent, causal, natural order. By separating stable exotic species from local monstrous anomalies, medieval thinkers accidentally carved out a space for natural law.
How so?
Because if this was all just about theological moral policing, why did the great 13th century encyclopedists like Thomas of Cantimpré rely on Aristotle to provide purely biological, reproductive explanations for these anomalies?
You're talking about the mechanisms of birth here.
Exactly. When Thomas of Cantimpré discussed the birth of two-headed snakes, he didn't just throw up his hands and say, God made this to punish us for our sins. He cited Aristotle.
Interesting.
He explained that if two seeds are contained in a single uterus without a dividing wall, a monstrous snake is generated. He gave a structural plumbing explanation. That is proto-empiricism. That is looking for a physical mechanism, a physical cause, rather than just defaulting to divine intervention. So I have to ask you, if the framework was fundamentally theological, why bother with the uterine wall mechanics at all?
Wait, so they were essentially using Aristotle to explain the biological plumbing of a divine miracle?
Yes, which shows they cared about the biology.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That distinction between the marvelous species and the monstrous individual actually reinforces the moral view.
How?
Yes, they borrowed Aristotelian biology to explain the how of the mechanism, but the why remained deeply theological. A local monster wasn't just a biological glitch, it was viewed as a deliberate suspension of the natural order by God to send a targeted message. And we see this most violently when the physical anomaly is tied to a moral transgression.
You mean the hybrids?
Exactly. Look at the historian Gerald of Wales. When he wrote about the natural wonders of Ireland in the 12th century, he was relatively benign about animals. He even described a hybrid born from a stag and a cow, with a sort of neutral curiosity, because animals aren't bound by moral laws. They can't sin.
Right, a cow doesn't know any better.
But when he documented an Irish woman having sex with a goat, producing a half-human, half-goat hybrid, his reaction was explosive. He erupted into furious invective. It wasn't a biological curiosity, it was a horrifying rupture of moral norms.
So it was about the sin, not the biology.
Exactly. The horror was occasioned by a normative cause, the violation of divine law, human reason succumbing to bestial sensuality. So in their minds, the physical deformity was merely the outward fleshy manifestation of the internal sin. Bringing in Aristotle to explain the uterine plumbing doesn't negate the fact that the entire event is framed as a divine punishment for moral depravity.
That is a compelling way you look at it, though. I would frame Gerald of Wales a bit differently. He is actually a great transitional figure. Yes, he moralizes the goat-human hybrid, but his book on Ireland is also bristling with personal observations of flora and fauna, and he actively critiques earlier Roman writers for being inaccurate.
He did have a keen eye. I'll give him that.
Right, he is actively testing knowledge against his own eyes. But let's look at how this knowledge was packaged and disseminated. If they believed this was all divine punishment, how did that translate into the books people were actually reading? Did the encyclopedias reflect that terror?
Well, they were written by clerics, so yes.
Initially they were, but if you track the history of these massive encyclopedias, you see a distinct secularization over time. The massive 13th century works by Thomas of Cantimpré or Bartholomeus Anglicus certainly started as clerical tools. They were textbooks for friars preparing to preach sermons, but they evolved. They broke out of the monastery. By the 14th and 15th centuries, they were being translated into the vernacular languages: French, English, German,
for a lay audience.
But the text itself, the actual content, remained largely the same.
The content was similar, yes, but the reception and the framing changed dramatically. Look at the visual evidence of the manuscripts themselves. In the earlier versions, the illustrations show austere philosophers or monks lecturing to students in a very serious religious setting.
Right.
But if you look at the lavish 15th century manuscripts produced by artists like the Boussicode master, the imagery shifts entirely.
To what?
Suddenly, you have illustrations of wealthy noblemen, including King Charles VI of France, sitting around learning about the properties of fish and water. It looks like a nature documentary viewing party. The prologues written by the vernacular translators stripped away the religious preaching and explicitly marketed these books as general summaries of the physical world. They were consumed for earthly curiosity, for the sheer pleasure of knowing about the world. That is an aesthetic, secular engagement with nature.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the foundational texts themselves and the explicit purpose for which they were compiled? You cannot strip the theology out of texts that were quite literally built to be theological engines. Vincent of Beauvais and Bartholomeus Anglicos didn't write to entertain French nobility. They wrote, in Bartholomeus' own words, to help audiences understand the enigmas of Scripture.
But doesn't the later lay audience's use of the text matter more for the trajectory of scientific thought? I mean, if a king is reading it to learn about fish, does it matter that a monk wrote it to explain the Bible?
It matters because of how the knowledge is structured. You can't separate the two. The Bible is written in figurative language, using the natural world for metaphors. To understand the Bible, Augustine argued, you had to understand nature. If Scripture tells you to be wise as serpents, you need a naturalist to explain what a serpent's nature actually is so you know how to act. That is why these encyclopedias were compiled.
So they were essentially dictionaries for biblical metaphors?
Exactly. And remind yourself of the bestiary tradition. To the medieval mind, a panther wasn't just a cool exotic animal with a spotted coat that you might see in a zoo. The bestiaries explicitly stated that the panther's famously sweet breath represented Christ saving humans from the devil.
Wait, explain how that works for the listener. How does a panther represent Christ?
Okay, so in the medieval bestiary, the lore was that a panther would eat a meal, sleep in a cave for 3 days, and then wake up and roar. When it roared, a sweet-smelling breath would come out of its mouth, which would attract all the other animals in the forest, but it would completely terrify the dragon, which would flee.
That is wildly specific.
Very specific. Now, to the medieval reader, this wasn't biology. This was an allegory. The panther is Christ, sleeping in the tomb for 3 days. He wakes up, the resurrection, and his sweet breath is the grace of God, which attracts the faithful animals, but repels the devil, which is the dragon. It's like looking at the world as an escape room, where every animal is a coded clue to your salvation.
I'm not entirely convinced that every animal functioned that way. Because while the bestiaries definitely allegorized familiar animals like the panther or the pelican, many of the new exotic wonders pouring in from the east didn't have allegorical meanings attached to them yet.
Some didn't, sure.
Like the Indian manticore, for example. It is described in these same texts purely as a terrifying beast with a human face, a triple row of teeth, and a scorpion's tail. There is no moral lesson attached to the manticore. It's just a wonder of nature. It's just cool.
But the overarching principle, the reason they cared about the manticore or the panther at all, was the Augustinian mandate that all of creation is a mirror reflecting the Creator. I mean, Vincent of Beauvais literally called his encyclopedia the speculum naturale, the natural mirror. The physical truth of the animal, its descriptive accuracy, was entirely secondary to its moral allegory. The natural world was a text written by God, and the job of the scholar was to read it for spiritual instruction, not for empirical data collection.
I think we have to look at the tension between the intent of the authors and the reality of the texts they produced. Yes, Vincent of Beauvais wanted to show the wonder of creation as a reflection of God, but the sheer volume of material he collected, thousands and thousands of chapters on everything from the exact size of elephants to the specific colors of regional flowers, created a comprehensive database of natural history.
A database built for theology.
But even if his motivation was purely theological, the result was a systematic cataloging of the physical world. And as time went on, that cataloging became an end in itself.
I don't disagree that the cataloging happened, but we are debating the primary nature of this fascination. And I maintain that the cognitive passion of wonder in this era was intrinsically linked to awe, fear, and reverence. When a peasant or a prince looked at a wonder, they weren't forming a scientific hypothesis. They were feeling the presence of an omnipotent God who could bend the rules of reality at will.
But they recognized that the rules existed.
Yes, but the fact that the natural order could be suspended so easily that a woman could give birth to a monster or a stone could burn in water proved to them that natural laws were not ironclad. They were subject to a higher moral jurisdiction.
But again, that's exactly why the distinction between the monstrous individual and the marvelous species is so vital. By isolating the unique divine portent from the stable exotic species, these thinkers carved out a space for natural law. The portents were the exceptions. The marvelous species were the rule. It was just a rule from a different climate.
That is a very modern reading of it.
But it's in the text. By recognizing that wonder is relative, that what is bizarre to us in Europe is totally mundane to the Ethiopians or the Indians, they implicitly acknowledged a universal natural order that isn't just a series of arbitrary divine whims. That is a massive, massive conceptual leap toward modernity.
A leap, perhaps, but one taken with both feet still firmly planted in the Middle Ages. You can't tell me that when the priors of Florence barred those conjoined twins from entering the city, they were acting as proto-empirical scientists calculating geographic relativity?
Well, no.
They were acting as terrified sinners trying to ward off the apocalypse. The normative power of the monster was real. It dictated politics, it dictated religious observance, and it dictated the boundaries of acceptable human behavior.
This is a perfect place to summarize our positions, actually, because we've covered incredible ground today. My perspective is that the shifting depictions of the East, moving from fear to genuine aesthetic delight, show a changing European mindset. The travelogues of Marco Polo and Mandeville, the recognition that wonder is geographically relative, and that brilliant intellectual separation of stable exotic species from unique local anomalies. All of this demonstrates a medieval world that was increasingly valuing nature's diversity for its own sake.
And it was a fascinating shift.
They were driven by a proto-empirical curiosity that sought biological explanations, like Thomas of Cantempray's use of Aristotle's uterine mechanics. And in doing so, they inadvertently laid the groundwork for the secular observation of nature.
And my position remains that despite the romantic trappings of the Eastern travelogues, the core machinery of the marvelous remained deeply theological. The framework was built by Augustine to illuminate God's absolute omnipotence in the everyday and his terrifying wrath in the local prodigy.
Right. Whether it was decoding the sweet breath of the panther as the resurrecting grace of Christ, or panicking over the birth of a hybrid as a rupture of divine law, the natural world was never an autonomous secular machine. It was a strict moral text. It was heavily policed and meant to be read for spiritual salvation, not just earthly pleasure.
I think we can both agree that the high medieval and early modern cognitive passion of wonder was incredibly complex. It wasn't just one thing. It was a unique historical moment that fused both rational, systematic inquiry and profound religious awe in ways that completely defy our strict modern categorizations. Absolutely. The very fact that they could simultaneously hold Aristotelian biological theory and Augustinian moral theology in their minds at the exact same time when looking at a two-headed snake shows a depth of thought that we often unfairly dismiss as primitive.
Yeah, it really does.
There's so much more to explore in these source materials regarding how these early intertwined frameworks of theology and early empiricism eventually shaped what we now call the scientific revolution.
Which brings us back to that Hereford Mappa Mundi we started with. When you look at the edges of that map, with the bleeding trees and the giant-footed men, you aren't just looking at ignorance waiting to be cured by modern cartography.
No, you're looking at a deeply textured worldview. A world where the margins are dangerous, thrilling, and saturated with divine meaning all at once.
You're looking at a society trying to map its own limits,
They were exploring how far nature can stretch before it breaks, and what that breaking point tells us about ourselves. Thank you for joining us on the debate. We'll leave it to you, the listener, to decide what you see when you look at the monsters on the edge of the map.